you afraid? You threw the heels at the bread? What's this?
Before Audrey Meadows ever stood in that tiny Brooklyn kitchen, before Alice Kramden became one of the most famous sitcom wives in television history, there was another Alice. Her name was Pert Kelton, and for most viewers, she might as well have vanished. She was there at the beginning, standing across from Jackie Gleason when the Honeymooners was still raw, loud, and almost dangerous. She was not the polished Alice most people remember from the classic 39. She was sharper, harder, more streetwise. When Ralph Kramden barked, she did not simply roll her eyes. She fired back like a woman who had been fighting this battle for years. Then she was gone. Not killed off, not given a farewell, not explained to the audience with honesty. The public version was simple enough: health problems. But behind that explanation sat something colder, something much bigger than one sitcom, one character, or one missing actress. The blacklist had reached into Ralph and Alice Kramden's apartment. That is the part nostalgia usually leaves out. Because The Honeymooners is remembered as one of television's great comfort shows. The cramped kitchen, the empty wallet, the loud husband, the patient wife, the upstairs neighbor with the loose-limbed walk, the famous threats, the famous apologies, and that final emotional release when Ralph says, "Baby, you're the greatest." But the first Alice Kramden never got to become part of that immortal image. She helped build the marriage. Then television history moved on without her. And once you know what happened to Pert Kelton, The Honeymooners stops looking like just a classic sitcom. It becomes a story about who gets remembered, who gets replaced, and how easily a performer can be erased when the machinery of television decides she is inconvenient. The show survived, the character survived, the kitchen survived, but the first Alice did not. Part 1. What made the show work? The genius of The Honeymooners was that it did not look like a dream. In an era when many television families were presented inside cleaner, brighter, more comfortable homes, Ralph and Alice Kramden lived in a Brooklyn apartment that looked almost aggressively ordinary. The walls were bare, the furniture was plain, the kitchen was not charming in a magazine way. It was cramped, functional, and worn down by life. That room mattered. It told the audience everything before anyone said a word. Ralph Kramden was not a rich man pretending to have problems. He was a bus driver with big fantasies and small paychecks. Alice was not decorating a suburban dream home. She was trying to keep dignity alive inside a place that constantly reminded her what they did not have. That is why the comedy landed. The show was not really about poverty, but it understood pressure. It understood the kind of marriage where love and frustration live on top of each other. It understood how money could turn a tiny disagreement into a household explosion. It understood how dreams could become ridiculous when a man like Ralph tried to force life to become bigger than it was. Ralph Kramden was the engine. Jackie Gleason played him like a human boiler about to burst. Ralph wanted respect, wealth, status, admiration, and control. He wanted to be the man with the plan, even when the plan was terrible. His body moved like confidence, but his eyes often gave away panic. He was always one bad decision away from humiliation. Alice Kramden was the blade. Her function was not just to be Ralph's wife. She was reality. She was the voice that cut through Ralph's fantasy before it could float too far above the floor. When Ralph dreamed, Alice measured the rent. When Ralph bragged, Alice remembered the last disaster. When Ralph threatened, Alice stood there and made the threat look ridiculous. That balance was everything. If Alice had been weak, Ralph would have seemed cruel. If Ralph had been too dangerous, the comedy would have collapsed. If Alice had been too soft, the marriage would have felt unbearable. The reason the show worked was that Alice could take the air out of Ralph's bluster with one sentence. Then came Ed Norton. Art Carney's Norton was not just the best friend. He was comic oxygen. Ralph was heavy. Norton was light. Ralph stomped. Norton floated. Ralph tried to dominate the room. Norton wandered into it as if gravity was optional. He worked in the sewer, but he carried himself like a man who had discovered the secret music of life. Norton made Ralph funnier because he made Ralph less alone. He was the sidekick, the irritant, the bad helper, the accidental philosopher. If Ralph was a man fighting the world, Norton was the friend who made the fight more chaotic. Trixie Norton had less screen time, but she mattered to the machine. She gave Alice someone to talk to, someone who understood what it meant to be married to a man whose confidence was larger than his common sense. Trixie helped turn the show from a two-person argument into a neighborhood ecosystem. Together, the four characters formed a pressure cooker. Ralph schemed, Alice resisted, Norton complicated, Trixie observed, and by the end, the fantasy usually collapsed back into the kitchen where it began. But this is where the story gets strange, because the version of that machine most people know was not the first version. Before Audrey Meadows became Alice, Pert Kelton stood in that role, and her Alice was not a footnote, she was part of the foundation. In the early sketches, the world of the Honeymooners felt rougher, closer to argument than sitcom rhythm. Kelton's Alice had a different temperature. She did not feel like a woman gently tolerating a foolish husband. She felt like a woman who knew every inch of the apartment, every weakness in Ralph's ego, and every empty promise he had ever made. That made the original marriage sharper. When Ralph pushed, Kelton's Alice pushed back with the force of someone who had earned the right. The comedy was not polished into legend yet. It was still being tested in front of audiences, still figuring out how much tension viewers would accept if the jokes were strong enough and the reconciliation came at the end. The audience responded because it recognized something true: not idealized marriage, not fantasy marriage, not a world where problems disappeared after a lecture from dad. This was marriage as combat, routine, disappointment, loyalty, and survival. The cruel part is that the woman who helped shape that original combat would not be the woman America remembered. Part 2. The First Cracks. To understand what happened, you have to remember what television was in the early 1950s. It was young, hungry, and terrified. Networks were fighting for talent. Sponsors had enormous power. Live television could make someone famous overnight, but it could also destroy them quietly. And above the entertainment industry hung the shadow of the blacklist. Careers were not always ended in public. Sometimes the phone simply stopped ringing. Sometimes a role disappeared. Sometimes the official explanation was health, scheduling, or creative change. And sometimes everyone in the industry understood the real reason, while the audience was told something else. Pert Kelton walked directly into that climate. She was not an unknown beginner. She had worked in vaudeville, Broadway, movies, radio, and television. She knew how to play broad comedy without losing the human edge underneath it. That made her a natural fit for Alice Kramden. She could stand next to Jackie Gleason's force and not get swallowed by it. That was not easy. Gleason was enormous on screen, not just physically, but energetically. He could fill a stage with irritation, embarrassment, panic, or wounded pride. Any actress playing Alice needed to do more than react. She had to puncture him. She had to make the audience believe Ralph could roar all he wanted, but he did not truly control the room. Kelton could do that, and that is why her disappearance matters. This was not a small recast in a forgotten sketch. This was the replacement of the woman playing one half of the central marriage in what would become one of the most influential sitcom formats in American television. When Audrey Meadows arrived, she became magnificent in the role. That has to be said clearly. Meadows was not a weak replacement. She became the definitive Alice for millions of viewers. Her timing was surgical. Her eyes could turn Ralph's biggest speech into a confession of stupidity. Her Alice had warmth, intelligence, sarcasm, and steel. But Meadows' success also helped bury the question: what happened to the first Alice? The answer leads away from comedy and into the politics of fear. Kelton and her husband were connected to Red Channels, the publication that listed entertainment figures accused of communist ties or sympathies. In that era, a name appearing in that context could be enough to damage a career. It did not require a courtroom conviction. It did not require an audience vote. Suspicion itself could become punishment. And so, the original Alice was out. The official explanation leaned on health problems. The deeper story involved blacklisting. And for the average viewer, the transition became just another invisible adjustment inside a fast-moving television world. But the show had already changed. Not because Audrey Meadows was wrong for Alice. She was brilliant. It changed because the first version of the Honeymooners had been touched by something no laugh track could soften. The business of television, the politics of the time, and the fear of association had entered the Kramden apartment before the classic 39 ever made it immortal. That is where nostalgia becomes complicated. Because when people say the Honeymooners represents a simpler time, they are usually talking about the surface, the black and white image, the bus driver uniform, the old New York rhythms, the live audience laughter, the catchphrases passed down through families. But behind that simplicity was an industry making brutal decisions, and Pert Kelton was one of the people left outside the frame. Part 3. The Turning Point. Picture the early version of the Kramden apartment. It is not the clean memory of the reruns yet. It is a sketch stage. The format is still forming. The characters are still hardening into icons. Ralph comes in full of noise, grievance, and self-importance. He believes he is the king of his tiny kingdom, even though the kingdom barely has furniture. And across from him is Alice. Not Audrey Meadows' Alice, Pert Kelton's Alice. The viewer expects the familiar pattern. Ralph complains, Ralph boasts, Ralph threatens, Ralph collapses. But Kelton changes the voltage. Her Alice feels less amused by Ralph and more exhausted by him. There is a bite in her presence. She does not just answer him, she meets him at full strength. That matters because the entire show depends on what happens when Ralph's fantasy hits Alice's reality. Ralph wants to be bigger than his life. Alice keeps pulling him back into it. Ralph wants the world to see him as important. Alice knows exactly how much money is in the house. Ralph wants obedience. Alice gives him truth. In later years, fans would remember the famous threats, "One of these days," and "To the moon." Those lines became part of American pop culture, repeated, softened by nostalgia, turned into impressions and references. But inside the room, the only reason those threats could play as comedy was because Alice did not crumble. She was never written as a helpless target. She was Ralph's superior in emotional intelligence, practical judgment, and verbal control. The joke was often not that Ralph might hit her. The joke was that Ralph's bluster was empty, and Alice knew it. Still, watching it now is more complicated, because modern viewers hear those lines differently. What once played as exaggerated domestic bluster can now sound ugly. Even if the show itself usually undercuts Ralph, that tension has become part of the show's legacy. The laughter still exists, but it no longer arrives without questions. And that brings us back to Pert Kelton. The first Alice had to carry that tension before the formula became beloved. She had to face Gleason's Ralph when the marriage was still rougher, when the show was closer to kitchen sink combat than cozy rerun ritual. Then she disappeared. The turning point was not a single episode where the audience saw Alice walk out. That would have been easier to understand. It was more subtle than that. A performer who helped create the character was simply no longer the woman standing across from Ralph. Television kept moving. The apartment remained, the jokes remained, Ralph remained, Norton remained, Alice remained as a character, but the original Alice was replaced. And because Audrey Meadows became so good, so beloved, and so central to the classic version, the replacement became almost invisible. That is the haunting part. Sometimes erasure does not look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like a better-known version arriving afterward and taking over the memory. The audience did not know it yet, but television history was being rewritten in real time. Not maliciously, in every direction. Not simply, not in a way that reduces Meadows' performance or the brilliance of the classic 39, but rewritten all the same. Pert Kelton became the Alice before Alice became immortal. That is a brutal place to stand in history. Part 4. Behind the Scenes. Behind the scenes, The Honeymooners was shaped by ambition, money, technology, and pressure. Jackie Gleason was not merely the star, he was the gravitational force. The sketches grew because audiences wanted more of Ralph and Alice. What began as a recurring routine became too powerful to remain only a piece of a variety show. CBS understood that. So did sponsors. By the mid-1950s, the idea was to turn The Honeymooners into a filmed half-hour sitcom. That decision mattered because television was still figuring out how to preserve itself. Live broadcasts could vanish. Kinescopes could look rough. But The Honeymooners used electronicam technology, capturing the feeling of a live performance while preserving the episodes on film. That helped make the classic 39 reusable. And reusable television becomes immortal television. The show was performed in front of a large audience. That live energy is part of why the episodes still breathe. You can feel the stage timing. You can feel the performers riding the laughter. Gleason did not want the show to feel over-rehearsed into lifelessness. The danger of mistakes was part of the electricity. But that same production world was also unforgiving. The blacklist era made performers vulnerable in ways audiences could not see. A person did not have to be written out with dramatic music. They could be professionally isolated. Their absence could be explained with a phrase. The show could continue, and the public could be trained to accept the new version as if it had always been there. That is what makes Kelton's story so sharp. She was not erased because the character failed. She was not replaced because the marriage did not work. She was not removed because viewers rejected Alice. She was caught in a larger machine, and when a machine that powerful moves, individual talent does not always matter enough to save you. Audrey Meadows then entered one of the most difficult positions an actress can enter, replacing someone in a role already associated with a hit routine. She had to convince Gleason, the producers, and the audience that she belonged in that kitchen. The famous story is that Gleason initially thought she looked too attractive to play a working-class Alice, so Meadows presented herself in a more worn-down, unglamorous way to prove she could inhabit the role. Whether told as industry legend or career strategy, it reveals something important. Alice Kramden could not look like a fantasy. She had to look like a woman who had spent years budgeting, arguing, forgiving, and surviving. Meadows understood that. Her Alice was not Kelton's Alice, but she solved the same structural problem. She made Ralph safe enough to laugh at without making him harmless. She gave the show its moral center. When Ralph became too large, Alice made him small again. When Ralph became too foolish, Alice made the audience feel sane. So the show did not collapse after Kelton, it crystallized, and that is what makes the story more painful. The replacement worked, the show became iconic. The classic 39 became the version burned into American memory. The later audience did not feel a missing piece because they had never been trained to look for one. But if you trace the history backward, you find the empty space. The first Alice was still there, buried under the legend. Part 5. The Damage. The damage was not that the Honeymooners became bad, it did not. That would be a false story. The classic 39 are classic for a reason. They are tight, physical, loud, beautifully timed, and often emotionally precise. Episodes like TV or Not TV, The $99,000 Answer, and Better Living Through TV show exactly why the format worked. Ralph's hunger for status keeps driving him into humiliation. Norton's innocent weirdness keeps derailing the plan. Alice sees the disaster before it arrives. Trixie completes the world upstairs. The show did not lose its magic after Kelton. It found a different magic. But the cost was historical. Pert Kelton became a ghost in a house she helped build. The audience remembered Audrey Meadows because those were the episodes repeated endlessly. Syndication turned the classic 39 into ritual. Families watched them on local stations. New Year's marathons turned the show into a holiday object. Ralph Kramden became part of New York identity. Art Carney's Norton became one of the great supporting characters in sitcom history. But repetition decides memory. The episodes people see again and again become the truth. The versions that disappear into archives become trivia. And for decades, many early television performances were difficult to access, incomplete, or treated as secondary to the famous filmed run. That is how a founding performer gets pushed to the margins. The other damage is moral. The Honeymooners is a show about working-class frustration, but its own history contains a different kind of powerlessness. Alice Kramden could stand up to Ralph Kramden inside the script. Pert Kelton could not stand up to the forces gathering outside it in the same visible way. Inside the comedy, Alice always had the last word. Outside the comedy, the industry did. That contrast gives the story its sting. And then there is the show's broader cultural shadow. Ralph's threats toward Alice. For many fans, those lines are harmless because Ralph never follows through and Alice is never truly intimidated. For critics, the repetition of those threats makes the show harder to defend without context. Both things can be true at once. The show can be brilliant and uncomfortable. It can be foundational and flawed. It can be funny and still carry the assumptions of its time. That is why the Honeymooners remain so fascinating. It is not frozen innocence. It is a pressure mark from 1950s America. The money anxiety is real. The gender tension is real. The masculine insecurity is real. The fantasy of escape is real. Ralph always wants to rise above his station, but the apartment keeps pulling him back. Alice always wants him to grow up, but she also loves the man behind the noise. Norton lives in the same economic world, but somehow finds music in it. The comedy survived because it was not built on perfection, it was built on friction. But friction leaves marks, and Pert Kelton's disappearance is one of the deepest marks because it reminds us that the show's own world was not protected from the fears of its era. Part 6. The Ending. The strangest thing about The Honeymooners is that the version people call immortal barely lasted as a standalone sitcom. One season, 39 episodes. That is all it took. Most shows need years to become legends. The Honeymooners did it with less than 40 half hours because the formula was so strong and the performances were so exact. But even during its original run, pressure was building. Competition was intense. The half-hour format could feel restrictive compared with the longer sketches. Gleason worried about maintaining the quality of the material, so the weekly sitcom ended in 1956. But The Honeymooners did not really die. It returned in sketches, it returned in musical versions, it returned in specials, it returned in syndication. It returned every time someone imitated Ralph's bluster, Norton's walk, or Alice's devastating stare. That is why calling it cancelled feels too small. The half-hour series ended, but the idea escaped. Still, the later revivals also showed how delicate the original chemistry was. Gleason could recast the wives in some versions, but Art Carney's Norton was treated as irreplaceable. That tells you everything about how the machine worked. Ralph needed Norton in a way that went beyond plot. Norton was the rhythm Ralph bounced against. Without Carney, the music changed. Audrey Meadows eventually returned in later specials. Pert Kelton, in a strange twist, returned in the 1960s not as Alice, but as Alice's mother. That detail feels almost surreal. The first Alice came back to the Honeymooners universe, but not to reclaim the role she originated. By then, the legend had already chosen its Alice. Kelton died in 1968, Gleason died in 1987, Meadows died in 1996, Carney died in 2003. Joyce Randolph, the last surviving member of the famous foursome, lived until 2024. By the time Randolph passed, The Honeymooners was no longer just a sitcom. It was an artifact, a ritual, a blueprint, and a debate. It had influenced future sitcoms, including shows that transformed the loud working-class husband and his patient wife into new shapes. It had helped define the domestic comedy. It had shown that a show could be visually simple and emotionally durable if the characters were built like engines. But the first Alice remained the part of the story many casual viewers never learned. And that is why this is not just a recast story. It is a memory story. Television does not only preserve performances, it ranks them. It repeats some until they become permanent and lets others fade until they feel like rumors. The classic 39 made Audrey Meadows eternal. They made Ralph and Norton eternal. They made the kitchen eternal. Pert Kelton became the shadow before the spotlight. Conclusion. The tragedy of Pert Kelton is not that the Honeymooners failed without her. It is that it succeeded so completely that millions of people never knew she had been there. That is the coldest kind of erasure. Not the kind where every trace is destroyed, but the kind where the replacement becomes so beloved that the original starts to sound like a secret. The audience remembers the apartment, the threats, the apologies, the schemes, the sewer worker upstairs, the wife who could cut Ralph down with one look. But before the Alice America remembers, there was another woman in that kitchen. She stood across from Jackie Gleason when the show was still being born. She helped define the argument at the center of the marriage. She gave Ralph someone strong enough to fight. Then the blacklist era reached in, and the official story softened what had happened. Health problems, political pressure, industry fear, a role recast, a legend rewritten. The Honeymooners remains one of television's great comedies. It is still funny, still sharp, still alive in a way most shows from the 1950s are not. But its history is not as clean as nostalgia wants it to be. The tiny Brooklyn kitchen was built for laughter. But if you look closely, there is someone missing from the room. The first Alice Kramden did not leave the legend. The legend left her behind.